Let's eat cake.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to The Financial Diet. In last month's video essay, we talked all about reality TV and how it's become a kind of financial funhouse mirror, both reflecting our own excesses and increasing the pressure on us to imitate the glamorous lives we're seeing depicted on screen. But the truth is, we don't even have to turn on our televisions to see this exact phenomenon in play. Consumerism has reached an all-time high, even as people are less able to afford the basics, and we increasingly feel baffled when we open our phones and look at the lifestyles of seemingly everyone around us. Put simply, one of the most common questions that we hear at TFD is, how is everyone always on vacation? Because it may not always come in the form of luxurious international travel, although it often does, but this question speaks to a greater dissonance in our society. A feeling that everyone is somehow much better off than we are, at least judging by the image that they project, especially online. For example, here in the US, we are in the peak of wedding season, a time when the lifestyle we're projecting is most out of step with our actual finances. The average wedding runs you about $28,000, which, when you consider that the median household income is $74,000, is completely nonsensical from a financial standpoint. And yet this disparity is actually just a more clear example of the bigger problem at play since the rise of social media, especially when it comes to millennials and Gen Z, which is the lifestyle we're expected to project versus what we can actually afford. This culture of rampant consumerism and a revolution in how we buy things and who we buy them from has created a kind of class dysmorphia, an expectation that we should be able to live like kings and show it off, no matter our actual financial reality. It's not surprising that there has been a big push lately to unfollow and block influencers who use their massive platforms to push products people don't need and to enrich themselves personally, while remaining silent on all kinds of incredibly important issues that their platform could really impact. We'll talk more about this later, but the day-to-day cognitive dissonance of what we see online versus what we experience has become untenable. And people are beginning to realize that this entire business model depends on selling people a lifestyle that they could never afford. Which brings us to Chapter 1, Influencer Marketing, the MLM-ification of economics. If you look around and feel that the lifestyles you see aren't based in reality, that's because they're not, and there has generally been a very targeted effort to make it that way. And much like an actual MLM, there is a specific dynamic of haves and have-nots who make up the hierarchy of aspirational living. There are the people who can actually afford the dream, often through generational wealth or otherwise being independently wealthy. Then there are the people who sell the dream via monetizing their lives and the content they create from it. And then there are those who go into debt or financial precarity trying to buy the dream, not knowing that it was never based in reality. And while this model of selling a life to people who can't afford it is relatively new, at least as it pertains to social media, the entire concept of an influencer is actually quite old. From dictionary.com, the word influencer has been used in English since the mid-1600s, though of course back then it wasn't a job title. In recent years, the term has become a catch-all for a certain kind of career track that is at the center of a burgeoning but profitable industry. For most of its existence in language, influencer was used broadly to refer to someone or something with the power to alter the beliefs of individuals and as a result impact the course of events. But when the earlier term influence entered English, it was used in reference to the movement of heavenly spheres, particularly in the context of astrology. How fortuitous for the many, many astrology influencers. Now, though, this term has a much more specific and economic connotation, generally online and most frequently on social media, to influence the purchasing habits of the people that follow them.
So this is your sign, run, don't walk, to TikTok shop.
Good, it's only $6 on TikTok shop.
Go ahead and link it, and you can tell your husbands that you're welcome.
And as we look back through the eras of influencing as we conceptualize it now, there's a very clear female bent to the genre. And in some ways, it actually did start out as a kind of revolutionary, taboo-breaking thing. It was essentially a way of getting a message out that wasn't being told by traditional media. Journalist Taylor Lorenz argues in her book Extremely Online that the concept as we know it of an influencer was pioneered by, you might have guessed it, mommy bloggers. Quote, the earliest content creators were really, I would argue, the mommy bloggers, the Gen X moms, Lorenz told NPR. They had an ability to be real and authentic and talk about these really taboo, tough subjects that at the time absolutely no one in traditional media would ever even acknowledge. Postpartum depression, addiction, drinking wine at your child's daycare pickup, not always loving your kids, or having problems breastfeeding. Lorenz argues that those mommy bloggers even laid the foundation for today's $16.4 billion influencer industry at a time when there was no built-in audience for the internet and there was no built-in monetization. And while we do know a lot about MLMs here at TFD, we also sat down with an MLM expert who can speak to the phenomenon a little bit better.
I absolutely see an overlap between MLM culture and influencer culture. In both cases, there is something being sold to the viewer, typically a lifestyle or products to help you achieve that lifestyle. So in the case of multi-level marketing business opportunities, the reps want you to believe that you can live a life of wealth and freedom if you just join their team and become a rep yourself. And they're really selling this dream of the idyllic life that you can live if you take them up on their opportunity, if you buy what they're selling, essentially. And in the case of influencers, maybe they're not selling you an entire job or way to make a living, or, they're not trying to entice you to become an influencer yourself in the same way that multi-level marketing reps are trying to entice you to become an MLM rep yourself. But they do try to sell you products that they want you to believe will improve your life in some way. This is the best cleaning tool. This is the most flattering pair of jeans. This is the most delicious protein powder. The list goes on. And it happens in MLMs too, because MLMs also sell products. So in both cases, I think that followers of these accounts or of these people in MLMs or influencers, they might feel as if they're being sold to constantly. They might feel like they're under the impression that they have to spend a bunch of their own money to be able to live the same glamorous life they're seeing these people live on social media. And what I want people to understand is that MLM reps and influencers are selling a lifestyle, maybe one that they're not even living themselves.
That monetization, though, is the clear difference between the original iterations of influencing and what we have today. Because as money enters the picture and you are no longer just speaking to an audience, but selling to an audience, the incentive structure completely changes. And in some ways, the entire concept of influencer marketing to sell products makes perfect sense from a human perspective. We crave connection and are fundamentally creatures of imitation. So the value proposition of lifestyle figures, that they're showing you an intimate look at their real life in a way you don't usually see in media, turns into a very easy sales pitch. You know me, you can trust me, now buy what I'm selling. And social media is designed to cultivate parasocial relationships where people feel an intimate personal connection with the people whose lives they follow. And the stronger that perceived connection, the more likely you are to trust that person. And this isn't just speculation, by the way. By some estimates, consumers are 82% more likely to buy products that influencers promote. But this MLM-type structure of the haves at the very top selling to people who are fundamentally have-nots really shows itself in two major ways. One, when a person's business is their life, every aspect of that life is ripe for monetization. That's how you get creators whose every moment is filled with paid endorsements or gifted products, even down to things like sponsors for their wedding, which many prominent influencers have done. And two, perhaps more relevantly, when a creator selling a specific image of themselves and of their own relatability is not being honest about their financial situation, you quickly see just how insidious the business model becomes. Which brings us to Chapter 2. Influencing, the ultimate nepo baby career. One of the inherent qualities of the internet, especially the social internet, is a kind of implied lack of hierarchy. The message is usually, if I can do it, you can do it. And things like relatability and authenticity are considered the most paramount values. And sometimes this MLM-ification of selling the dream gets so literal and so redundant that the influencers are literally selling you classes on how to influence. But given how prevalent influencers are in our culture now and how much of an impact they have on our consumer habits, it's time to acknowledge that the myth of the self-made influencer is basically just as much of a myth as the self-made billionaire. And the irony of influencers trying to seem more and more relatable is that there's typically a prerequisite for becoming an influencer in the first place, and that is having money. In order to demonstrate a lifestyle that people are going to want to aspire to have time and resources to create content, to be able to to put your energy into growing your online platform rather than working a job. All of these things take money, kind of regardless of the type of content you create. And when we talk about nepo babies, it seems like the conversation mostly revolves around Hollywood, but nepo babies are everywhere in all industries. And to me, a nepo baby in the purest form is someone who has a direct familial connection to the industry they want to work in, which is not always necessarily entertainment. But it can also be someone from a wealthy enough family that their often lofty professional goals can be prioritized from a young age. Literally just look at the Olympics roster and you'll find an astounding number of people from privileged backgrounds, because with exceptions like Tonya Harding, that's who can afford figure skating lessons. And as anyone who saw the impeccable Margot Robbie performance in I, Tonya knows, Tonya Harding's working class background was actually part of the reason her career in figure skating was doomed from the get-go. And in some ways, influencing has become the ultimate career for nepo babies, no matter what their niche is, because it seems like everyone would have an equal opportunity for visibility, but money and connections give you a substantial leg up. Think about some of the more innocuous but still very popular genres of influencer content. Things like home organization reels of extremely large or well-stocked kitchens, home decor content generally, especially when a creator is constantly redecorating an already perfect space, which we'll get into even more later, or travel content, especially when it doesn't explicitly mention budget and they're always casually filming from their business class suites. And listen, am I jealous? Am I bitter? Yes, of course. I would love to have the disposable income to just constantly be flying business class to international destinations. Those seats are so much more comfortable. But if you don't believe me, let's just run through a few quick examples of some very prominent influencers who come from very prominent money. You have Hannah Bronfman, a member of the extended and super wealthy Lehman family. Her father was formerly CEO of Warner Music, and she's a quote angel investor who's been investing in companies since she was 20 years old. You have Serena Kerrigan, whose father is a successful Hollywood writer-director and co-creator of the show The Girlfriend Experience. She's also mentioned her father going to boarding school in England. There's Kit Keenan, daughter of fashion designer Cynthia Rowley, also appeared on a season of The Bachelor. There's Paige Lorenz, who grew up in Connecticut and went to a very prestigious boarding school in Vermont that is specifically for training skiers, which is also one of the most expensive sports. There's Charli D'Amelio, who literally became famous as a teen, posting from her family's extravagant home in Norwalk, Connecticut, which is a very old money town, and still isn't even 21. Her father is the owner of a very expensive New York City showroom, and she went to the King School, which is an extremely expensive private school. There's Maddie Monroe, whose father is a professional baseball player. And those are just a few examples of prominent influencers who come from identifiable family wealth, where we know what the parents did, how they made their money, where they went to school, etc. But when you start to scratch beneath the surface of almost anyone who's made a substantial career in influencing, you start to notice some telltale signs of undisclosed wealth. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Here's just a few of the frequent offenders. Things like vacations at family beach houses or Hamptons estates, insane homes in the backgrounds during holiday videos, sailing, yachting, or just being around boats generally. Take it from me, I used to work at a yacht club. Living in expansive New York City apartments when they are clearly not old enough to have a job yet, owning a home at a very young age, having traveled extensively as a kid or a teen, a dad working in business or finance with a stay-at-home mom, or parents working in the industry where they're ostensibly influencing. And here's the thing, it's not necessarily about having money. People make money in all kinds of ways. And I would be a hypocrite to not acknowledge that I am now someone with substantial financial privilege despite growing up low income. The bigger problem is the value proposition and the MLM style dream that is being sold. The numbers among Gen Z and Gen Alpha of kids and teens who want to grow up to become influencers is staggering. And part of that is the impression that being an influencer is a way to make extraordinary amounts of money they otherwise wouldn't be able to, not dissimilar from things like a professional athlete or a musician. And because of the social nature and the accessibility of things like a ring light and a camera, it's a lot easier to imagine that this could be an even playing ground where anyone could make a name for themselves. But the fundamental issue is that in the vast majority of cases, even if you do end up making a lot of money influencing, and most don't, you generally have a very high startup cost to get to the level of influencing where you would be able to monetize it. But the whole concept depends on that fundamental idea of relatability and if I could do it, you could do it. Without that, the whole pyramid scheme starts to fall apart. So keeping things obscure and low-key gaslighting audiences is the norm. Which brings us to chapter 3, the smoke and mirrors of digital life. So we all know by now how much social media is a highlight reel. People are much more inclined to show off the good parts of their lives rather than the negative or mundane.
We spoke with Kaylin Grace Apple, a higher education creator who quit full-time influencing, about the financial pressure of being an influencer and why she ultimately decided to quit.
This looks like a variety of things. So one, it's knowing that your paycheck every month is going to be relatively similar. So even if you're a wage worker, as I have been many times, where you're paid hourly, you can at least calculate, okay, if I put in this many hours, I know I'm going to get generally this payout after taxes. When you are creating content, as I said, there's a huge flux in how it is that your income is coming in, at what rate it's coming in, and then you also have to do the tax calculations and things of that nature. Financial stability also looks like planning for your financial future. So having a pension, knowing how to actually manage your money in such a way that you are building a savings, things that actually require a lot of financial literacy. And for you to operate as a business owner is something that takes a lot of time and energy in order to cultivate. And for me, I just felt like I didn't quite have the chops to do so in a way that felt secure. And also speaking to financial stability for my future, and this is something that I don't think many people talk about, is, for example, you are not a desirable borrower if you are looking to, for example, finance a mortgage, or even if you're trying to lease an apartment. I constantly got pushback from apartment buildings saying that I needed a co-signer when I'm nearly 30, and that I would need a co-signer in order to sign for an apartment because my financial income just doesn't look as secure as somebody who works a full-time position. And so when I'm thinking of what I want my future to look like, I don't want to constantly have to justify my professional position and the income that I have. And so ultimately decided that the career route that I wanted to take was going to require more financial stability and more opportunities for my financial future. And those were the primary considerations. There's also some like emotional considerations as well, but honestly, it really came down to my financial freedom in terms of my financial future.
As MIT professor Sherry Turkle, PhD, wrote in her book Alone Together, Why We Expect More from Technology and Less from Each Other, quote, "On social networking sites such as Facebook, we think we will be presenting ourselves, but our profile ends up as somebody else, often the fantasy of who we want to be." A survey from 2015 found that women spend a massive 16 minutes perfecting every selfie, totaling over 5 hours a week. And while we may no longer be in the era of posting carousels of 7 options for essentially the exact same selfie anymore, we are just as calculated about what we decide to put online, even if it's simply learning what angles work best for us. Listen, I have an angle. I like one side better than the other. I'm human. So in light of this, it's no wonder that we have come around to demanding more authenticity from creators when you can tell that everything you see is a highlight reel or played up for the purposes of being performed for an audience. Of course, content that feels more vulnerable and human is going to strike a chord. But we are no dummies, especially not people whose job is creating content. And that experience of authenticity and vulnerability is just as easily something that can be packaged and optimized.
Yeah, I personally think authenticity with influencers is everything. If you don't have that trust with your audience, you don't have anything, right? You have to make sure that your recommendations are genuine and that the content you're creating surrounding those recommendations is going to be received well by your audience. But unfortunately, I think sometimes the dollar sign kind of buys people's opinions out. Unfortunately, I think that sometimes the money does talk. And if this is your full-time job to be an influencer and to recommend products, sometimes you might be more compelled to recommend something that you may not actually really like or that much, or that you might not use in your daily life, but you've got to pay the bills, you've got to feed your kids, that kind of thing. It really backs influencers into a corner in that way. And so because of that, I unfortunately believe that we have to assume at least a portion of influencers' lives are fabricated to some degree. I think it's definitely a spectrum. I've seen some examples examples of influencers who do straight up lie. They create a piece of content that is entirely fictional. It's based on made up events, even though they try to portray it as real life. For example, I talked about this in one of my YouTube videos recently about lying influencers. Somebody created an Instagram reel titled "What I Spend in a Day in New York City with No Budget." And then she shows all the different receipts of, the breakfast that she ate at a restaurant. And then she goes to get gas in different grocery stores, but all the receipts are showing dates from different days. And so just, based on that, it's a completely falsified piece of content. You didn't spend all that money in one day, but for some reason you're creating this narrative that you want your followers to believe that you did.
This can go so far as to certain influencers even utilizing homes they do not live in for the purposes of content creation. And don't worry, we'll get into this on our later chapter on real estate. But perhaps no single app tells a better story about our relationship with faux authenticity than the recent rise and questionable fall of Be Real. Now, this is a social media app that was meant to force users to showcase their lives in real time. But eventually people stopped posting unless they were actually doing something interesting, funny, or impressive, or they waited out the timer until they could be sure to post during times that were more engaging. And when it comes to fabricating reality, we also cannot ignore the elephant in the room that is credit card debt. We couldn't find any specific studies on the relationship between influencing and credit card debt, although academics, get on it. But as I discussed in last month's video on reality TV, a lot of the cachet that one needs to maintain to become a popular public figure depends on having money. And this trickles down all the way to normies who are just wanting to present a more aspirational life to their small groups of personal followers.
So I started my YouTube channel when I was in college. I did have grants and loans and other means of support to get me through university. And so because I wasn't worried about my day-to-day expenses right out because of those grants, the additional money that I did make as an athlete, I put towards being able to, for example, buy a camera. Had I been in a position where I was working full-time, I wouldn't have had that additional means of income because all of my income would have gone to my daily expenses. So I think I was in a stage of life where I was socioeconomically privileged because I was a student and had grants and things to support me. And the other piece of why I think certain influencers perform really well is if your lifestyle is baseline aspirational to the average individual who does not have socioeconomic mobility, who does not even have socioeconomic stability, that, having housing security is at the very baseline aspirational for some people. And that is therefore appealing in terms of content. Being able to show that you live alone, for example, is a remarkable privilege, and especially in the United States. And that to somebody is aspirational. So even you just creating content, for example, like living alone vlog, like that in and of itself has a higher percentage of interest for people because that is aspirational. And so the people that succeed naturally will come from a socioeconomic situation that is aspirational for a lot of people. That's not to say that there aren't influencers that come from a variety of backgrounds that are not socioeconomically aspirational. However, I think that they would have had to start creating content at a much earlier time than if, for example, you were trying to start to become an influencer now.
To the question we mentioned in the intro, how is everyone always on vacation? There is a real feeling on social media that what you're looking at financially is not an accurate representation of people's lives, and that is true. And while we here in the TFD community are very used to speaking on things like credit card debt, it is still a phenomenon that's heavily wrapped in misinformation and stigma, and has become kind of a dirty little secret to this hyper-attractive life we're all supposed to be living. And there are some telling statistics that we can point to that I think heavily implicate the impact of social media specifically on our spending habits. For instance, in the area of over-the-top wedding spending, we see just as much of the bachelorette parties and other tangential festivities on social media, with bachelorette parties in particular having morphed from one night on the town with your girlfriends to multi-day retreats, sometimes taken internationally, which cost guests over $1,200 to attend on average. Here's a guest from our recent wedding mini-series on our podcast, The Financial Confessions, who personally went into over $10,000 of credit card debt to be in other people's weddings, about one particularly galling purchase that she was on the hook for.
On her bachelorette, there was a guest who put her card down, and the bride said, as a reminder, don't charge Abby. And the guest said, okay. And then I got a Venmo request for $700, and the only thing I had that night was a Sprite.
And the travel industry, too, has been impacted by social media, in some ways helping to create a more egalitarian travel landscape, but at the same time helping to contribute to over-tourism. We did a whole video on this, which we've linked below, but it's worth noting that travel companies are spending much more on social media marketing than they used to. Quote, since 2021, the travel industry has seen increased digital ad spending, growing from $4.8 billion in 2021 to $6.79 billion in 2023. This trend doesn't seem to be dying out anytime soon. In 2024, ad spending is expected to double that of 2022, reaching nearly $8 billion by the end of the year. That's about a 14.3% increase from 2023. And by 2025, travel ad spending is projected to increase to $8.77 billion. Now, obviously, the COVID travel bounce back does play a big role in these numbers, but I think that there's an argument to be made that we've gone even further into social media-driven experience spending since the early COVID days. I always remember one of my favorite quotes from the early days of COVID, which is, "Passport as identity, Twitter, is never going to recover from this." But travel is one of those rare spending categories that we've managed to conflate with people's overall character, intelligence, curiosity, and worthiness, rather than just something any old dickhead with money can choose to spend on.
It's funny because when I first started my PhD, I was pretty much entirely reliant on my PhD stipend. And so I couldn't afford to have a car. I could never afford to buy clothing. I could barely afford to live on my own and buy groceries and take care of myself. I didn't have savings. I was just trying to get by. And since creating content and it becoming a monetized vehicle, I became so much more readily aware of the aesthetics of my content and the aesthetics of myself and the way that for example, the way that my body and the way that like my physical being was presented, and feeling quite insecure about the things that I was wearing on camera, or that if I was wearing it too often, if I kept wearing the same shirt over and over again. And my spending in terms of feeling like I needed a new camera or a new shirt, or I needed to be showing that I was doing exciting things, all of those costs went up. And the thing that is a bit of a cycle with becoming an influencer is that because the economics of the business that you've built, you can, in a way, write off a significant number of those expenses. But that's still spending money. That's still spending your income. And so my consumption of clothing and makeup and things of that nature that I felt were necessary in order to, maintain the audience and maintain the interest and all of that went up significantly, which is silly because I actually don't think my audience would care.
But this increase in how much pressure social media has added to our lives to spend is perhaps most notable in our next chapter. Chapter 4, Real Estate, the Ultimate Content Mine. One of the more infuriating aspects of the MLM-ification of social media to me is how it's taken real estate and homeownership from a human necessity, at least when it comes to having a place to live, and a financial investment, to being another victim of hyper-consumerism. Now, perhaps one of the most frustrating examples of the overconsumption hamster wheel that social media and the influencer MLM put us on is in the homes we live in. Because real estate now isn't just about creating a home for yourself or your family, or even about building up an investment, which is in and of itself dicey territory, no matter how many real estate hacking TikToks want to tell you otherwise. It has become yet another form of self-expression through consumerism, a way to communicate to the world the type of person you are, and ultimately yet another area of life to monetize thanks to social media.
So one thing that I notice a lot with influencers in particular in America is they, in a way, exhibit what I think people imagine to be the American dream. So for example, living in a big city and then being able to buy a home and then, having a big fancy wedding and, being able to send their kids to nice schools and put them in nice clothing. I think that's something that's very largely inaccessible to so many people. The idea of owning a home was something that I had given up on when I was, in my early 20s, just looking at the realities of what my career was going to look like. But then to see that influencers, have this additional income that can then be filtered into things like being able to buy homes, I think it gives an unrealistic view of what somebody's general finances could look like.
I did a newsletter series earlier in this year for our members, which was all about how I navigate social media at a time when I'm investing in my home. I own my home for the first time in my life. I did a whole video breaking down every aspect of that purchase, and yes, I'm still very proud of my 2.875% 30-year fixed mortgage rate, but that means for the first time in my life, I've embarked in some home renovations. I redid aspects of my kitchen, and this little library you see behind me was the culmination of a pretty much lifelong dream. Now, I don't have a ton of square footage to work with, so there's not that many opportunities for big investments in the home, but as someone who also loves home decor from a personal and creative perspective, it's something that I really look forward to. It's a hobby, it's a passion project, but it's also a way to feel really, really bad about yourself online. And I have found that in times when I'm investing in my home in any capacity, I have to fundamentally change the way I use the internet because the hyper-consumerist culture we've created around homes is just beyond toxic to our mental health. Creators who make a career out of homefluencing are constantly changing their spaces to keep up engagement. These are just a few examples from one single home creator, all posted in 2023. And this is no shade to her specifically, this is just to illustrate the kind of changes that homefluencers have to keep making in order to stay on people's feeds, to have new fresh content, and in many cases to honor the agreements of sponsored content. Here's the same living room in July versus January 2023, a skylight upgrade / DIY project, a room swap tied in with a sponsored post, styling a new shelving unit, styling a different shelving unit, and showing off new Etsy finds. And we've slightly blurred these images just to even further reduce the perception that this is about her specifically. It's not. It's about the phenomenon. And I think we can all agree that this stuff is gorgeous. But as consumers, it creates an incredibly dangerous precedent where the entire concept of your home, the fact that you're investing in long-term equity if you own it, the fact that it provides a necessary living space, the fact that it should be something sustainable where you're ideally purchasing one thing to last you for decades, is completely lost. And it is essentially following the same fast fashion-esque model that prioritizes constant newness over real value. And a lot of the time, what you see on these accounts are maybe not sponsored outright, but have been gifted by brands or were gifted many years ago, which makes it not only affordable and sometimes financially necessary for them to keep updating their space, but also creates a completely false precedent for how affordable this would be to the average consumer. When your home is your business, it essentially becomes a sort of geode of sponsored content, just crystallizing year over year with more and more things that have been accumulated from brands.
I think there is an unimaginable amount of undisclosed, sponsored, or advertised content in influencer content because ultimately it's much too difficult for the FTC to manage it, and people can get away with it extremely easily, especially when you're doing something through an Instagram story where it disappears after 24 hours and that kind of thing. So unless people are actively paying attention and reporting influencers for undisclosed ads, and then the FTC is doing something about it really quickly, it's just not going to happen. There's not the resources for that. And so I think that that's an extra layer of deception when influencers don't tell you this is sponsored or I got paid a set amount of money to promote this product, because it's at that point, it's not a genuine recommendation. They might love the product, they might actually enjoy it, but you have to assume that they probably wouldn't be promoting it if there wasn't some financial incentive behind it. And that is their job, and we can't fault them for that, but it is frustrating as a viewer to not be able to discern what's a real genuine recommendation and what's not, because I'm not going to want to put my money into purchasing something if you don't actually like it. You're just saying that you do because that's your job. It's frustrating from a viewer standpoint to do that. But I do really think that there are so many more undisclosed ads than we even realize. Even though it is the law, you do have to disclose if it's sponsored or advertised content. Not everybody does because it's easy to get away with.
And in some cases, influencers aren't even living in the spaces that they're creating content in. We've obscured it again, but this is a recent TikTok from a creator and model who admitted to moving out of her extremely gorgeous pre-war apartment to the suburbs to have more space for her family, but ultimately still keep the apartment so that she could create aspirational lifestyle content there. And this is all especially wild in the context of homeownership over the past few years. Quote, amid dogged inflation, as Americans grapple with the steep cost of everything, homeownership has become an elusive goal to achieve. It peaked in 2005 when well over 2/3 of American housing units were owner-occupied. This homeownership rate then began to sink, down to 63.1% in 2020, its lowest level in 5 decades. It has budged only slightly since then. And I want to stress, buying a home can be a wonderful thing. Creating a space that you love, that feels like you, and that you would rather spend time in than go out and spend money where things are vastly more expensive can be a great thing both financially and personally. It can be a wonderful way to express ourselves creatively. But this influencer MLM structure has made it fall victim to all of our worst consumer impulses, which is sort of the opposite of equity. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it sometimes feels as though the wheels are starting to fall off the bus when it comes to the influencer MLM. People are starting to realize more and more that what we are being sold is often a complete fabrication, and that the business model of those at the top depends on continuously duping those at the bottom. But I would argue that the cracks really started to show well before this, especially in Chapter 5, the COVID-19 pandemic, when the cracks really started to show. So when it comes to just how different the dream we're being sold is from the one we're actually living, few moments illustrated it more clearly than the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic and just how much it was not stopping influencers or celebrities from living their absolute best lives. You know, we had to do a montage of people living their best lives during the pandemic.
People are gonna die. It's just terrible, but like, inevitable?
You had everything from people throwing private parties on yachts, to hosting private invitation-only concerts and festivals, to Vanessa Hudgens kind of kicking off the whole pandemic by insisting that we shouldn't let it prevent us from going to Coachella. There was a distinct feeling back in those days, especially the earliest days in the pandemic, that while most people were expected to make enormous personal sacrifices in order to preserve this sense of community, for the wealthiest among us, there was just a total abandonment of that community and what we owe to our fellow humans in service of whatever happened to be the most vibey at the time. Here in New York, it was particularly difficult, and as someone who not only was in New York, in her New York City apartment for all of the early days of the pandemic, but was also alone because my husband had to leave the country due to immigration issues, every single day felt like an absolute punch in the face from my fellow New Yorkers. While some of us were hunkering down and doing that little thing, banging pots and pans at 7 p.m. every night to thank our first responders, which still makes me emotional to think about, the wealthiest elites in the city were just sort of getting on the Oregon Trail, virus in tow, and moving it on down to Florida, where they could party freely on the beach. This was all happening while refrigerator trucks were literally lining the streets of the city to house the New Yorkers we lost because we didn't have enough room in morgues. And when you look at literal maps of how New Yorkers migrated, you can see that the wealthiest areas saw the most people leaving the city. But for a lot of us during that time, we were seeing on social media the reality play out that for a certain segment of people, especially the people whose entire job is living beautiful, glamorous lives, the rules just didn't apply. And we're now seeing a similar wave of frustration rise, culminating in a recent campaign to unfollow and block influencers who heavily monetize their own platforms, but will not speak out on basically anything that matters, from Roe being overturned, to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, to the fact that there's a whole fucking presidential election happening this year. Like, do these people even live on planet Earth? It was maybe an unfortunate but fortuitous tipping point that this video we highlighted in the intro seemed to just tweak people's brains. A fabulously wealthy influencer whose entire career is built on selling people a very specific dream, dressed up in a fabulous designer gown, outside one of the most glamorous parties in the world, saying let them eat cake. I think it just tore open a hole in the space-time continuum. And in many ways, I think the frustration people feel today, especially with the lack of transparency and accountability as it pertains to finances or community, has a lot of leftover energy from what we saw happen during the pandemic. With Chapter 6, The Bottom of the Pyramid, Protecting Your Finances in the Influencer Era. And because we are ultimately a personal finance channel, we want to talk about how we can keep a handle on our finances and our sanity in light of all of this. The unfortunate reality is that any good pyramid scheme needs a bottom. And like any good MLM, we can also delude ourselves for a very long time about our personal ability to make it up the ladder, especially when everyone is sort of acting as their own quasi-micro-influencer on their own social media accounts. And let's be clear, I can tell you from running a digital media company for the past almost 10 years that it is extremely difficult to make real sustainable money off of ads.
So when I was doing it full-time, I was probably making between $1,000 and $10,000 a month. Now I probably make about $1,000, $2,000 at most. And most of that money ends up going into savings and towards student debt, basically to pay off expenses that my general income, my salary, can't cover. And so I do still take on sponsorships, but I'm much more choosy, and many of the sponsorships that I do are with companies that I've worked with for multiple videos or multiple years, and that I just enjoy working with, and I generally use their technology or I use their product regularly.
And while a few people are able to do it, and we've been pretty lucky over the years to sustain ourselves with that, more and more creators like ourselves are moving to a model where we have memberships and create content that people pay for. Because even for the people at the top of the pyramid, the finances are starting to get out of whack. And let's be clear, most influencers aren't making much at all. According to a 2021 survey from Hype Auditor, an influencer marketing platform, less than 50% of influencers said that they earn money from their accounts, and on average, they earn $2,970 per month through Instagram, or $36,540 a year, which is below the median income in the US. And still more and more people are bamboozled into thinking that this is a possible aspiration, or that the average influencer you see living a fabulous life got there through hard work. But when it comes to our own consumer habits, we have to be mindful that at the same time, we are buying what they're selling. According to LTK, a shopping platform that enables brands and creators to monetize their influence, 66% of Gen Z and millennial consumers actively shop through influencers. In 2023, influencers on LTK reportedly drove over $4.1 billion in annual sales, which continues to grow yearly as the platform reported. And this is just a stat from LTK, where influencers host their own shops for their followers to easily buy the products they're shilling. We certainly can't account for all the other influenced spending that people do outside of those links. So how do you opt out and gain control over your own consumer decisions? Something that, again, I had to do a radical reset on when I was going through my home renovation, because I am equally susceptible. I see shit all the time that I think looks amazing and makes me want to have it and makes me feel inadequate with what I have, even though I'm literally looking at a budget that's 5 times what I'm able to spend. In my experience, when it comes to navigating these things in a more healthy way, there are a few key rules. Number 1, first and foremost, is opting out of any social media that triggers you to spend in an unsustainable way. Now, I did cover this somewhat in our Gen Z video essay, but I want to reiterate here that we are all in some ways victims of circumstance when it comes to overspending and overconsumption. Real-time retail, TikTok, Instagram or Shop, buy now, pay later apps are all examples of things that make it way too easy to accumulate more than we could ever need. Next, remember that whether influencers are selling us cheap fast fashion or overpriced custom skincare, they are really selling a specific lifestyle. The MLM is all about the dream of what your life could be if you were only able to buy the right things. And anyone who makes you feel as though you have to spend in order to be a certain person is probably not a great follow. Because outside of the epidemic of undisclosed SpawnCon, which is also a problem, this is all legal. So the best things you can do are get honest with yourself about what is actually worth spending on and rewire your relationship with who you're following. To actually work through exercises to find spending that aligns with your values and your needs, we created tools in our book Beyond Getting By, and we also did a whole video on this very topic a few months ago, and I'll throw to that video for a tip.
So how can you stop over-consuming in your own life, especially when it comes to things that you don't even like, and adopt a real abundance mindset? I've personally always advocated for combing through your bank and credit card statements and literally highlighting every purchase you either regret making or don't even remember. And this can be really tedious, but I do think it is important to tangibly confront your own spending habits. You can then start to categorize your spending habits based on a scale of mindless to intentional. And this is an activity that we put in the book, which I'll share here. Mindless consumption is often the spending decisions we make simply because we were influenced, whether by social media or our IRL social circles. And I would argue that mindless purchases are often the ones we regret the most, and they would fall on the left side of this matrix. And when it comes to intentional spending, this does not always mean spending a ton of money. Frugal purchases can absolutely be intentional.
I think the biggest danger is the risk of comparison. I think that so much of what influencers post is at least slightly fabricated in some way, even if it's just as minor as clearing out the corner of their room to film something in a nice clean space. You know, there's so much going on behind the camera that we don't know about, and it's not fair to yourself to try and compare yourself to what you perceive somebody else's life to look like throughout the internet. And the finished product you see on social media, again, it's planned, it's performed, it's filmed, it's edited, and just by virtue of that process, it's not a depiction of real life. So I know that saying comparison is the thief of joy is kind of cheesy, but it 100% applies to how we use social media. I am in full support of following influencers, engaging with their posts, and buying things from their links if you want to, but I do urge people to use their critical thinking skills regarding the full picture that's not captured on the camera. And I always say, enjoy the content responsibly. Really, treat it as entertainment and nothing more.
As another rule, while a lot of people will advocate for social media detoxes outright, it's also a sustainable answer to find more things that take up your time that take you away from your phone. Hobbies, activities, crafts. I mean, literally even watching TV is probably a preferable alternative to some of these spending habits. And my biggest rule of following accounts that make me feel bad about myself, something that is rampant in the home decor space, it can sound intuitive, but it's something not a lot of us do. And it actually is proven to work. Quote, a 2018 study found that reducing social media use to 30 minutes a day leads to lower levels of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and trouble sleeping. You can even just log out of your accounts so that you have to log back in every time you want to scroll, something I've had to do myself with TikTok. And for the many young people who aspire to content creation or to influencing, I want to say something as someone who has made her entire career on the internet and has had to navigate for almost a decade now the balancing act between putting a lot of myself out there and keeping something sacred in a way that allows me to pay my team adequately, to make a living for myself, and to do projects that I love, like my novels. There can be healthy ways to use these platforms. We can connect with communities that we otherwise wouldn't find. We can hold ourselves accountable. I never would have gotten good with money if I didn't put myself out there to find other people who also wanted to learn about it. We can help each other, we can make each other laugh, we can teach each other. And I think one of the most important questions to ask ourselves when we look at these platforms is, am I creating something of value outside of myself, or is my entire value proposition based on how fabulous I am as a person? Because when you look at a lot of the most popular influencers, it really does boil down to that. You go to their accounts and it's just pictures of them living their fabulous lives, looking beautiful, and being rich. And I do believe that that paradigm, making a career out of your life being fabulous, is not something that many people would really want if they understood what it costs to your mental health. There are real downsides to putting yourself out there at any level. I don't have to look very hard to find people saying really nasty things about me, and I just sit on a couch talking about money. But even for people who don't yet have large platforms, according to anxiety.com, YouTube and other social media sites are central to many adolescents' self-presentation and promotion strategies, or how they attempt to create a desired impression of themselves to others. Aside from the pitfalls of creating a successfully strong online identity, recent studies show that increased social media use is also associated with depression, anxiety, and sleep disturbance. It's a fundamental human motivation to form and maintain positive impressions of the self to others, but the presence of social anxiety can distort processes of self-presentation, particularly when social media sites become an anxiety sufferer's main conduit for engaging with the world. Individuals who perceive themselves as deficient in social media skills tend to develop a preference for online social interaction over face-to-face exchanges to minimize social risks associated with self-presentation. Whether these social deficiencies are real or imagined, these individuals tend to invest a disproportionate amount of attention, time, and effort into online socializing.
I think one of the biggest tricks I see influencers employing to get more views and engagement are those who would create pieces of content and not mention anything about the products at all, actually. So let's say that there's a lifestyle influencer who's posting a video titled "Clean and Organize My Car with Me." And yeah, you're watching the video, you get the satisfaction of seeing somebody clean and organized. Personally, I love that kind of content. I think it's really enjoyable to watch. But if you pay close attention, you'll see that it's just one huge advertisement where they're flashing one product after another, not necessarily stopping to say anything about the product or to call any specific attention to them, but they're using a little spray squeegee to clean the dash, and then they're using a special putty to get crumbs out of the cup holder, and then they're restocking their center console with cute little travel items and cute little containers, and they put an aesthetically pleasing car freshener in the air vent, and before you know it, you've watched a 60-second commercial for like 15 different products that you don't really need, but they're cute, and the influencer has sort of created a value for them by showcasing them one after the other in this rapid succession where you might not even realize that you're being sold to. It's not somebody coming on and saying, "This is the product I'm going to talk about today, and here's why it's great." It's someone saying, "Come along with me as I clean my car," and you're going to be subconsciously pitched for, 10, 15 different products. I think that is really, really sneaky. And then if you go to the comments of these types of videos, what do you find? You find people asking, "What's that little thing you use? What's the link? Where can I buy it?" So now you're driving up the engagement on your video because you've intentionally not addressed the products in the video in the hopes that people will leave you lots of comments asking about it to, increase the engagement, to push it out to more people on the algorithm. So the last other step, the next like extra tricky step that I see is that, influencers will say, "I'll DM you the link." They're kind of gatekeeping the information until you engage with them. They're never going to respond back and say, "I got it on Amazon," or "I got it at Walmart," or "It's, the product name is this, go search it on your own." They're going to say, "I'll send you the link," because they want credit for introducing you to that product. They want you to buy it through their commissionable link specifically so that they can make money off of it. And I guess even one step further to this trick is that now you will see automated replies. You might see an influencer post where they're not saying anything in the video, but the caption might say, "Comment the word car for all the links to the things that I'm showing you in this car cleaning video." And what that means is that the influencer has set up an automation service where they can choose keywords. And when those keywords are recognized in their comments, those commenters are automatically messaged a direct link to the products without the influencer having to do anything at all. So if you go to these comments, it's just car, 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 car. So again, you're driving up the engagement on these videos because everyone's just curious about what the link is or what the product is because you weren't upfront with it to begin with. So if you try this out for yourself, you will get an automated message in your DMs from the influencer's account within seconds. It's wild. I've tried it for myself. And that's a really easy way to tell if they're using automation. And ultimately, that's a really effective way to distribute your commissionable links with very little effort. And the algorithm recognizes all those comments as engagement. So the algorithm thinks that your video is really popular, it's highly engaging, so then it pushes that out to be viewed by more people, ultimately making the influencer more money because more people are using their links. I think all of those things are pretty sneaky and tricky that you might not pick up on right up front.
Simply put, the entire influencer economy is an MLM that changes our perception of reality enough to make us micro-influencers in our own lives. We look around and see that all of these other normal people are on vacation all the time, having these fabulous weddings, bachelorette trips, spending on new clothes every week, and we wonder how it's all possible. And the answer is, it's usually not. We've created a false sense of reality where people who were born with infinitely more than we'll ever have are selling us an identity of relatability that never existed because it's extremely lucrative. We can take a step back and rethink how we engage with these platforms to stop the ways that they're encouraging us to spend money we don't need or have on things that don't make us happier. But the first step is realizing that social media and the influencer economy within it, while they can be used for good, are often used to just create one big pyramid scheme, and it's worth being honest with ourselves as to whether or not we're at the bottom. As always, guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you here next month.